Mr. Chair, you saw my text about David briefing the bill. I hope.
Did, yeah.
Thank you.
Good morning, committee. We will call the meeting for Thursday, February 4th to order. First item on the agenda, I need to let everyone know that the documents for today's meeting have not been uploaded yet. Hopefully they will be shortly afterwards. We had a flood of documents and we had some technical problems, so they will be loaded as soon as committee is over. Bill introductions, Julie Hine.
Mr. Chair, Julie Hine represent the Kansas Pharmacists Association, and we would request a committee bill for a PBM regulation bill, and the RS number is 1021.
Any objections? Seeing none, it'll be introduced. Thank you, Julie. Committee, on your agenda are a reminder of deadlines that are getting closer and closer every day. 2/8 is the last day for non-exempt committees to request member-sponsored bill drafts. So keep those dates in mind, please. We are going to attempt our very first attempt at a budget overview this morning on Capers, and so I'm going to call on Stephen Wu with KLRD to give us an overview of the budget and the process. Stephen?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If it is all right, I think I'll defer explanation of the budget and subcommittee reporting process to our Assistant Director of Fiscal Affairs, Amy Deckard. She is also available on WebEx this morning.
Here at your pleasure, so you're going to have to take us through it, so however you want to do it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As Stephen indicated, I'm Amy Deckard with Legislative Research. I just wanted to walk you through the report process to make sure that everyone was clear before we did that first one for you. So traditionally, the members that review the budget would sign a signature page acknowledging that the report was ready to be sent to Ways and Means. This year, to minimize person-to-person contact, we're going to utilize the process we use for interim committee reports. So you will be emailed a draft copy of that subcommittee report by at latest the noon before the day the budget is scheduled to be heard in Ways and Means. We would ask that you reply to that email by 5 p.m. on that day. If we do not hear back from you, we are going to assume that is acceptable to proceed moving forward. If you do have concerns that report is not ready to be moved forward, please reply to that email that you will receive from the appropriate fiscal analyst. I want to note that there is still the option to do a minority report if you disagree with the contents of the report as it was voted out of committee. So just wanted to clarify the process we're using. Be happy to answer any process questions before Stephen starts explaining the budget.
Thank you, Amy. Are there any process questions before we start on the budget? See none. Okay. Stephen, you want to take us through this?
Sure thing. Just to double check, does the committee have the budget analysis document in front of them or access to them?
And I believe we do. What we have in front of us is Capers retirement system is what it's listed as.
Excellent. Yep, that's it.
Okay.
All right. Before I get started, I want to, as I understand it, Executive Director Alan Conroy is available in person in the meeting. The camera doesn't quite show the entirety of the room, so I can't quite confirm, but I've been notified that he should be there and available for the specific questions on the agency's operations. My presentation will focus on an overview of the agency's budget overall. So we'll sort of split the explanation of what's going on with this agency's budget between the two of us. So like I mentioned before, my name is Stephen Wu. I am a fiscal analyst with Legislative Research. I'm going to start on the first page of this analysis document. This first page, that table at the very top, you'll see an overview of the overall operating expenditures for Capers. As you know, the primary functions for Capers are to administer 3 programs. The first is the primary Capers Plan program, including Capers State, Capers School, and Capers Local. In addition to that, Capers also manages the KPNF, the Kansas Police and Firemen's Retirement System, as well as the retirement system for judges. Now, for budgeting purposes, it's important to mention that member benefits for Capers are considered non-expense items, which are not reflected on this budget document because those expenditures are already accounted for in other agencies' budgets. So in order to avoid double counting expenditures, they aren't reflected in this agency's budget specifically. Now, what the figures in this document do reflect are the expenses to administer and improve the system, which is what we'll be talking about today. Now, if I could direct the committee's attention to page 7, you'll see a summary of operating budget. It should be a landscape style table with an overview of both the agency's estimate for fiscal years 21 and 22, as well as what the governor recommends for those years. Just as a quick refresher, fiscal year 21 spans from July 1st, 2020 to June 30th of 2021, and fiscal year 22 is those same date ranges, but a year later. So July 1st of 21 to June 30th of 22. On this table, you can see a breakdown of operational costs for Capers across its various programs, its administrative programs, its costs for Capers investments, its deferred compensation program, and the death and disability benefits program. You can also see a breakdown by major object of expenditures, such as salaries and wages, how much Capers is paying to its employees, contractual services, commodities, capital outlay, and there are no expenditures in debt service or aid to local units or other assistance. Lastly, on the bottom of this table, you can see the various funds that contribute to the Capers operation and how those are broken down between them. As you can see here, the bulk of the funds for this agency come out of the Kansas Public Employees Retirement Fund. So we'll go year by year. Fiscal year 21, the overall summary for it begins on page 8. For this fiscal year, you'll see in that table up top that the legislature last year approved a little over $52.4 million for this agency. You'll see that the agency this year requested a little over that amount, about $64,000 more than that for its budget. Would like to note that these are all special revenue funds. There is no SGF included within this agency's budget, so no general funds are involved whenever I discuss the specific operations for this agency. Now, like I mentioned, there is an increase in this year of about a little over $64,000 over what the 2020 legislature approved. And this increase is primarily due to revised investment management expenses. The agency estimated expenses for these investment managers earlier on the year, and at a later point in the year, before it submitted its budget, it submitted some revised estimates based on more current information. This increase is offset by fewer administrative expenditures from its group insurance reserve fund. These administrative expenses are primarily for helping run the operations of the system to help manage it. Now, The agency request also includes expenditures to modernize the pension administration system. I'll be talking about this for both fiscal years, as it's a longer term project that the agency wants to engage in. So there is a more detailed explanation of this item later on, which I'll get to. But for now, just want to mention that for fiscal year 21, expenses start at about 1.5 million for this modernization project. Would like to note that specific to this isn't 1.5 additional dollars that the agency is requesting. It's funded out of what they already have for this year. So the governor's recommendation. The governor recommends for this agency a little over $52.7 million. Apologies, a little under $52.7 million. This is all from special revenue funds, and this is about $200,000 more than what the agency requested. And this is solely because of coronavirus relief fund monies. After the agency submitted its budget, the State Finance Council awarded KPERS the amount that was distributed from the CRF, the Coronavirus Relief Fund. And so the agency's budget submission was submitted prior to that, so they didn't have the money in its funds yet to reflect that. Those monies were entirely used to help improve its operations and to help KPERS work remotely during the pandemic. So at this point, that sums it up for fiscal year 21. I'm happy to continue on to fiscal year 22. Would also like to entertain any questions if the committee so has any.
Any questions on FY21? Senator Gossage.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Perhaps this question should wait until 2022. You can address that. But in earlier committee, they talked about, or it was mentioned in the budget, of re-amortizing KPERS. And is that something you can address in 2022?
Sure. I can touch on it briefly now. The expenses that come with the governor's proposal to re-amortize KPERS aren't reflected in the numbers here. The budget document you have in front of you is primarily associated with the costs that come with running the system, the administrative costs. The sort of amount to re-amortize is not included here. I or Director Conroy would be happy to go into that a bit further, but for the purposes of the agency's budget, those are considered separate items.
Senator Fagg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Could you talk just a little bit on special revenue funds, exactly line share what that is, please?
Yeah, absolutely. To do that, let's skip ahead briefly. If you turn to page 11, you'll see a description of a couple of the agency's special revenue funds. Okay. So the term special revenue funds refers primarily to any monies that isn't considered SGF, that isn't considered from the state general fund. So for KPERS, we're primarily talking about the Kansas Public Employees Retirement Fund. You'll see on that table in page 11 that about 95% of its expenditures come from that fund. And you'll see that description on that page gives some additional detail, including some statutory references of how monies are deposited into this fund.
Additional questions on FY21? Even I don't see any. Let's move on to FY22.
Excellent. So 22 starts on page 9. You'll see that for this fiscal year, the agency requests about $169.5 million. Apologies. My notes are incorrect. $60.6 million. These are all from special revenue funds. This is an increase of about $8.1 million from the previous year. And this increase is primarily due to modernization of the pension administration system. There's about $6.6 million of this in the agency's request for this year. The increase is also due to some additional expenditures for investment management fees, about $1.6 million. And they're offset a bit by some expenses that the agency had in 21 that aren't present in 22. So you'll see a slight drop based on that. So for this fiscal year, the governor also does concur with the agency request. At this point, I'd be happy to answer questions on 22, or I could go on to discussing the CAPERS modernization project, which has implications to both of these fiscal years.
Why don't you go ahead and talk about the modernization, and then we'll have questions after that.
Sure. So starting on page 13, you'll see a breakdown of the agency's costs by its various programs. Most of these costs are fairly similar year to year. They are associated with the administrative costs of running the system, as well as costs for expenses such as for investment managers. But the one big item that you'll see for this budget submission is the modernization project. The description of that starts on page 13. So some background first. CAPERS maintains a pension administration system to help collect employer contributions, to help pay benefits, and so on. In 2005, CAPERS partnered with Sagitech Solutions to implement the system, and that system has been in continuous use to this day. Since then, in those 15 years, CAPERS has had to make a number of modifications to the system because of plan changes or legislative actions. For example, they needed to make changes to account for the implementation of the CAPERS 2 and 3 plans. CAPERS also indicates that as time passes and as they have had to make additional customizations to the system, it's become less efficient and more unstable over time because they keep having to tweak it to suit the adjustments that they want to make. So the Board of Trustees decided to begin efforts to modernize the system. During the 2020 session, CAPERS requested and received approval to have an assessment conducted of the system so that they could determine the next steps forward. In June of 2020, CAPERS contracted with the Siegel Group at the end of an RFP process to provide that comprehensive assessment. And in September of 2020, Siegel completed that assessment and submitted its findings to CAPERS. And using that assessment, the board identified 6 major areas for modernization. You'll see those described in those bullet points at the bottom of page 13 to the beginning of page 14. Just as a high-level overview, those areas include foundational functions of the system, IT support, data support, various functions of the pension administration system overall, the implementation of a member web portal, the implementation of an employer web portal. And in addition to that, for budgeting purposes, CAPERS has also accounted for a contingency fund as well as for temporary staffing to help implement this modernization project. So you'll see a chart on page 14. This gives you a high-level view of what CAPERS anticipates this modernization project costing. In total, CAPERS has estimated about $20.6 million of funds required to modernize the system. You'll see that this is broken down between fiscal years. Like I mentioned earlier in my presentation, for 21, you'll see that little under 1.5 million for that. And you'll see that broken down between the 6 different focus areas. You also see that it jumps to 6.6 million in 22 and so on through 2025 when the project would be anticipated to be completed. At this point, it's important to note that CAPERS indicates that the preliminary groundwork that they're doing now for fiscal year 21 will help it determine whether to modernize the system or whether to replace it. And it anticipates knowing whether to modernize or replace sometime by July of 22. So the numbers reflected here are assuming modernization. If the conclusion that they reach at the end of this fiscal year is that modernization is not feasible, then they'll have to look into, they indicated that they will look into replacing the system overall, which would have different numbers associated with it. Now, the rest of the document contains additional details on the various programs within CAPERS. I'd be happy to go into detail on any of them, but at a high level, there aren't many significant changes in these programs across the fiscal years reflected in this document. The biggest changes are surrounding the Capers modernization project. So at this point, I would be happy to answer any questions either on the Capers modernization project or fiscal year 22 or on anything else. Otherwise, I would, at the committee's pleasure, I would turn it over to Director Conroy, who I understand has some comments to make of his own.
Thank you. Are there any questions at this point of Stephen? Senator Peck?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Wu, I'm going to ask you the questions, and I'm asking them, and if you prefer to defer or think that it's better for Director Conroy to answer them, that would be great. And then I'm going to stick a couple questions in my back pocket for Director Conroy, so he won't know what they are until after a while. But on the fiscal 22 budget, I noticed that there is a request, or there is funding to establish a contingency fund. Establishing a contingency fund sounds like there never has been a contingency fund. And can you elaborate a little bit on that? And then the next question on the same page is there's a request for additional money for expenditures for investment management increases. So those would be my questions of you.
Sure. So what I'm able to answer, the contingency fund reflects the contingency fund is for the modernization project specifically. It is an amount of dollars that Capers is setting aside specifically for this project. It doesn't relate to its other operations. It relates solely to this modernization endeavor. As for the investment expenses, as I understand it, they are based on the performance of the funds that those investment managers manage. So as those funds do better, those management fees would be slightly more than they otherwise would be. As for more details and a specific breakdown of how those fees are distributed, for that I think I would defer to Director Conroy.
Additional questions of Stephen? See none. Okay. Thank you, Stephen. Alan, do you want to address the committee on your budget?
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Yes, I'd be pleased to. And I'm not sure it gets any better than talking about pensions, but then talking about budgets for pensions. In terms of excitement, I'm not sure it gets any better than this. But certainly pleased to be here with you this morning to talk about that, and certainly to try to respond to any questions. I think in your documents there's some written testimony. And I'll just briefly touch on that just to remind you in terms of Capers, and Stephen's certainly done a good job laying the foundation. And I guess I frequently say from this sort of nondescript old IBM building over on Kansas Avenue, used to be next door to a Slotsky's, which unfortunately now has closed. From there, we run $23 billion. We serve over 300,000 members, active and retired. We interact with 1,500 employers across the state. Of those 300,000 members, a little over 100,000 are retirees. About 156,000 are active members. And those active members work, of course, for the state, all the local school districts, all the counties, almost all the cities. City of Wichita is large enough to have their own retirement system. And then you get into all those special purpose districts like drainage districts and a library board and maybe a public hospital, community colleges, and on down the list. So lots of interaction. And when we have that many members and those many employers, you can see in the testimony, I mean, we responded to over 90,000 phone calls last year, over 20,000 emails from our members, enrolled or transferred over 34,000 members. We paid out 1.3 million retirement benefit payments. In total, those benefit payments were over $1.8 billion with the B in 2020. As Stephen mentioned, the funding sources as the defined benefit plan, of course, it's a trust fund, so we're sort of unique in terms of state governments. It's a trust fund. the money that goes into that trust fund by IRS statute, by state statute, by case law, by IRS regulation, on down the list, that money can only be used for its intended purpose, as with any trust fund. So in this case, to pay the hard-earned retirement benefits that our members have invested in KPERS, provided the service, and then they've earned it, and it goes out from there. So once the money's in the trust fund, it can only be used for that purpose. Stephen mentioned on the revenue side, it really comes from 3 different sources. Over half of it roughly is from investment revenue. On that $23 billion currently, about a little over a third of it comes from employer contributions, and then the balance from employee contributions. The assumed rate of return on the trust fund is set by the board, is 7.75%. And we've been able to achieve that over the last 25 years. Certainly, if you think back over that last 25 years, certainly there's been lots of ups and downs in the market. Calendar year 2019, we earned 17%. For calendar year 2020, we're at 11.5%. And I wish I had a real good understanding and I could explain to you why we earned 11.5% in terms of the markets going up and up and up, generally up, up, up. I'm not sure I understand all the foundational reasons for that, but in the end, we have a return of 11.5%, which beat that 7.75%. I'll just briefly mention that there's also a KPERS 457 plan, which is a deferred compensation plan. It's optional. It's all employee money. State employees can participate in it, and then those local employers or other employers that want to participate, they can. Some have their own, and that's, of course, fine, and it's good for their members. But about over 300 employers have also affiliated with that. And there's over $1 billion, again, with the B in that trust fund as well, and that's a separate trust fund from the KPERS operating trust fund. In terms of specifically then on the 2021 budget, the board made the request, and the governor, as Stephen indicated, has basically concurred with that, with the Board of Trustees' request. And there's, of course, the biggest part of it on page 4 of my testimony is a table, and you can just kind of summarize this. But the biggest one is benefit payments, which is about a little less than $2 billion in 2021, a little over $2 billion in 2022. That's non-reportable, and Stephen can tell you the magic of being non-reportable, but it's not in terms of its funds sort of off budget, so in part so things don't get counted twice within the state budgeting process. So that's the biggest expenditure there. The second one, and Stephen's touched on this, are those investment-related expenditures. Again, we don't manage that $23 billion in-house. We do have an investment staff that monitors those external investment fund managers, and there's about 30-ish of those then that are assigned by the board. There's strict investment guidelines in terms of what they can invest in, what they can't. And of course, there's some statutory framework as well that we have to make sure we adhere to and they adhere to. So those external fund managers, their expenditures, as you'll see, it's about $36 million in the current year, $37 million in 2022. The increase there just assumes actuarial rate, that 7.75% will be earned. Their investment payments are based on how they do and the framework that they operate under. And of course, when you have a trust fund, an investment fund of $23 billion, that gives us great sort of economies of scale as we work with those and negotiate with those fund managers for fees. And so total fees in 2021 are 0.15% of the total assets. and it's estimated to be close to that 1.53% for 2022. And so I think it's very economical, the fees that we're paying to those external fund managers. And then the third part of the budget is the administration program, again, which Stephen's touched on, $16 million in the current year, $22 million in 2022, largely driven by the modernization project, our IT project for our internal operating system. And just to briefly touch on that, again, Stephen's given you a good framework there. Our system, our software system, old. I think you know, I've heard some things about IT systems, if they're not maintained and sort of age out. Our system is working, certainly paying the benefits that we need to pay, and of course that's our ultimate marker. But over those 15 years, again, as Stephen's mentioned, certainly some big changes, that modifications to that software system. So the advent of KPERS 2, which was for a group between, it was in 2007, and then in KPERS 3, which was created in 2012. It's a cash balance plan, which then required a change in terms of employer contribution reporting from annual to pay period reporting. So the systems work. I think the board's concern is any system that's 15 years old, this modernization project, if we stay with our current vendor, would be spread over 5 years, so that base system then would be approaching 20 years, and so they thought it was time in terms of enhancing that system, updating it. And there have been updates along the way, but this would be a major, I guess, revamp of that system if we stay with it. And again, that system, that IT system, it tracks all of those 300,000 members, so all that, you know, burst, service, salary, those 1,500 employers that send in contributions and payroll information, all that goes through that system. So there's a tremendous amount of information back and forth, and that's all, of course, critical information ultimately to make sure we're paying the appropriate and the entitled benefit to our members. So that was that's really the main I guess change or enhancement to this to the budget, the operating budget of KPERS. It's not something that the board entered into lightly. Clearly, it is a $6 million in the first year, $20 million over the next about five years. But I think the board believes it's necessary to continue providing the framework to deliver those benefit payments to our individual members. Mr. Chair, I think I'd stop it there and be glad to respond.
Thank you, Alan. Committee, are there questions? Senator Fagg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was wondering, Alan, if you could get into, just so I can learn something here. No money goes out of the state general fund. I see that. They talk about this debt we got to re-amortize. So if we don't have any state money that's going into this, who owes the debt? And because I don't see any debt service on here.
Actually, you collectively, the state of Kansas owes the debt on the unfunded actuarial liability, you and the employers. The KPERS system, particularly KPERS 1 and KPERS 2, it's a defined benefit plan. And so really the employees are contributing their statutory amount, currently at 6%. And as you may remember, half of the money roughly comes from the investment side. So as the investments do good, the employer contribution rate goes down. If the investments don't do so good, then the employer contribution rates have to go up. And so every year, the board, after actuarial analysis and all this effort, sets an employer contribution rate that employers, and particularly the state, and you may remember the state pays the employer contribution rate not only for all state employees, but all local school employees as part of state aid education. And of course, they're our largest group of the 156,000 public employees. 85,000, 86,000 are public school employees. So the state's paying that. So the state's paying the debt service through employer contributions, and it shows up in the budget. It's a fringe benefit in the individual agency budgets. So, you know, Department of Revenue, you know, there's, if you dig down in that, there's line item, you know, here's the salary, and you got to pay Social Security on it, you got to pay capers, you got to pay health insurance, and so that employer contribution there is, in terms of the state budget, is spread out among all the individual agency budgets, if that helps a response to your question.
That helps a little bit. Kind of to follow up to that question, as you look forward in that, and we got this amount of debt, so when we had years that was down, the state was not funding what they should have been funding? That's how the debt incurred?
There's several reasons, and that unfunded actuarial liability it is kind of like the mortgage on the house. There were major enhancements made on the benefit side in 1993, and the legislature at that time decided to pay for those enhancements. Well, one, that they would pay for them all. The employees would not have to pay for that increased benefit, but that amortization period, that mortgage then would be paid off over 40 years, so 2033. So that's the amortization period on this unfunded liability that was incurred. And back in 1993, there was going to be a big increase from those big benefit enhancements, and so the decision made at that time was we'll contribute, the legislature, policymakers decided we'll contribute less than that actuarially required amount just for a couple years, and then the goal was to try to get back to the actuarially required amount. Well, unfortunately, for 25 years then, this fiscal year, is the first time the state in 25 years will be contributing that actuarially required amount. So for those 25 years, the board says you all should contribute at this. The decision was made to contribute at this level. That difference doesn't go away. It's a debt of the employers, and so it rolls to that unfunded liability. We're charging 7.75% interest on it because that's the assumed rate of return. And so over half of that unfunded liability is because the employers, mainly the state, have contributed less than what the actuary said. And then there's some other things. There have been demographic changes. There's been some benefit enhancements and some other things. But the largest single factor of that debt in the trust fund is because the state paid less than what was supposed to for 25 years.
Okay, so that debt that we have today, we're kind of even now with what's going forward. How much is that debt?
The total is $9 billion with a B, and that'd be for state and school, and I guess local. That's the whole ball of wax for all the capers employers.
Did the school districts pay their portion at that time?
Everybody is not quite do that. State's been paying that employer contribution on behalf of the school districts for decades. And I don't know, there's some history there. Of course, the state appropriates the money to the State Board of Education. The State Board of Education then, for capers employer contributions, sends it out to the school districts. They receive it, so it touches their local budget, but then there's requirements. They, in effect, have to turn it right around and send it to us. They can't spend it for other purpose. They can't divert it, and they have to wire it to us like the next day. And so it goes out from the state to the school district. School districts send it right back to us. So it makes that loop, but it's all state money.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Olson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's probably a lot of things that have got us to where we're at with the capers. I just want to know a little more about, because I'm kind of hearing two things here, like we might just modernize it, but then I'm also hearing, sounds like we're accruing money to maybe replace it. How far down would that decision be made? If we're going to replace it or if we're going to modernize. I mean, because I don't want to patch it up, spend a bunch of money, and then, let's either replace it or modernize it.
Great question. And because of that, we decided then we're doing a proof of concept, it's called. So we took one of our processes, which is our member annual statement. Every year, we've got to send out member annual statements to our 156,000 members to tell them, you know, as of last December, you know, here's how many years of service, this is what you contribute. If you retire at this point, all those kinds of information. And that was unfortunately, it had gotten very cumbersome, very difficult to generate that. So we decided this proof of concept. So we're in like it's kind of like a test run for our current vendor to see if they can modernize just that part of the process and see how that goes. And if they're successful, I think that'll probably increase the chances that we'll stick with them. If we have lots of problems with this one, you know, with this one proof of concept, then I think we'd probably look to that. And I think Stephen mentioned, and I think certainly we're in the next few months, certainly by summer, I think we, the board, would have the decision made whether or not to go out, issue an RFP, see, you know, what other vendors are out there and what they might do, or stick with our current one. As you may know or might guess, again, IT pension administration systems, there's only about, I don't know, maybe about 4 vendors that would have the capacity to deal with a system like Capers. So the pool of people that will bid on it, if we go out for bid, is very, very limited.
Pretty slim.
Yeah.
One follow-up and then I'll be done. Have you seen any fraud or, I mean, I'm guessing you got some internal controls that you're back testing everything to make sure there's no fraud, and I'm sure legislative post audits audited you. I can't remember, but I think you passed with flying colors.
We did, thank you. They did IT, legislative post audit did just complete an IT assessment, you know, the periodic assessment that they do for all agencies, and it was Capers' turn, and we did receive a very favorable review in terms of that IT security audit. And you're right, we do have lots of internal audits. Things, unfortunately, you know, there's lots of death matches out there to make sure we're not paying somebody who has passed away, you know, that their retirement benefit, particularly if they live in another state. There's lots of programs now that can kind of monitor and check that. And same way with, you know, people that want to, even down to, of course, a lot of members periodically want to change their bank account, and the effort we go through to make sure, one, it is the member and it's going to the right bank account. Yeah.
Senator Pittman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was just going to comment on their stellar technology, tech report from post audit. I'm very impressed, although I don't want to make you a target now for anybody. So it was the best that we'd seen in years.
Thank you,
Senator Peck.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Back to the budget numbers that we were given, looking at fiscal year 2021 on page 8, sort of in the latter part of the first paragraph, it talks about the fact that your revised budget includes an increase of $344,000 for employees. And then when we look at page 15, under the administration part, the salaries and wages, actual 2020 was $8.57 million, and then the agency request in fiscal year 2022 is $9.4 million. Looks like to me like somebody's getting some pretty good salary increases because your FTEs are remaining the same, or do you care to elaborate on that? Does this all go to the director, or?
Good question. That part I can definitely tell you that would be no. But thank you. I think there were some changes in there. Certainly, as you look to 22 to 21, we are bringing on some temporary staff to backfill as a modernization project cranks up. So our key staff that would be involved in that modernization project, they're going to have to step away from their day-to-day duties to help with the modernization project. So we're backfilling with some more entry-level people on a temporary basis while this modernization project is going on. So I think that's certainly part of that change from 21 to 22. I think the 21 numbers, the decision was made by the board to add some additional investment staff. And so those are, and I think we shifted some vacant positions around, but certainly the cost for those investment staff to manage and monitor those external fund managers, you know, it's investment analysts for private markets, which would be, you know, like private equity, real estate, infrastructure, certainly challenging in terms of the investment world and the amount of work that goes in there. And then there was one on the market, on public markets as well. A lot of that in terms of our effort around COVID-19 and trying to work with our fund managers and monitor all of their things as all this is sort of happening, I think. So there was some additional staff needs there on the investment side, I believe, accounts certainly for a big part of it.
Got additional people, but your FTEs remain the same. Does that mean you have a decent amount of vacants? Vacant or something?
No, and of course, well, there's, I mean, vacancies, yes, and they, of course, sort of come and go. I think we've had some in benefits and member services. We've also had some in, I think, in the IT area as well. And so I guess we strive to keep those positions filled. And also then, but then as we move them, the FTE positions, some of those other positions may move to temporary to address a need. These investment ones, we thought they warranted, you know, an FTE position designation. So we kind of shuffled them around, I guess.
Just real briefly, Mr. Chairman, last thing that should be a fairly quick answer. Do you expect the salary cost to go back down after you get the new system and so forth?
I believe so. One, because we have some of that backfill, that temporary spending. So I think temporary staffing. So I think eventually those should go down as again. And we're hoping also that a modernization system will improve efficiency. And some of our system, which is still sort of paper-driven, would become switched to electronic, which should help move that processing along.
Alan, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Committee, we are very, very close on time. My Ways and Means Chair told me that we wouldn't spend more than 30 minutes on these. So clearly he underestimated, or we got farther in the weeds than we should have. I don't know which. I had intended to hear Senate Bill 86 today, so Alan, I apologize. We'll get that rescheduled. That is a crucial bill for Capers that we need to get passed out of here and get it on its way. We have two options at this point. If the committee is comfortable with the Capers budget, we could recommend today to kick that to Ways and Means, who will review it again. I would remind you that there is no SGF. It is strictly out of Capers money, and the agency request meets the governor's recommendations. So would the committee like to kick this out today, or would you like to spend more time on it? Senator Olson? I don't know. Never approved 2021 and 2022. That was your motion, right, Senator Olson? I thought it was. Senator Peck, seconds. Any discussion? Okay, seeing none. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Stephen, is that what you need to complete the report?
Yes, sir.
Okay, that will be emailed to you. You need to review it and respond back to KLRD to make sure it's correct, like we do on an interim committee. We will not sign them this year. You will respond by email. Okay, committee, thank you for your work. We will not meet tomorrow. We will not meet Monday. We'll be back here on Tuesday with the Chiefs' victory.